Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Daniel Davis's Deep Dive, where we're looking out for your interest, telling you the deep story behind the scenes, things that you're not going to get on any normal network television show, because we want you to we want to make sure that you've got all the information you need to know what's really going on. Well, we have another treat for us today in this episode. Friend of the show, Harry Kazianis, who is the senior editor at the National Defense Publication 1945 and president of the Rogue States Project. And Harry, we have a really interesting one to talk about today. Especially, I know you don't live in Washington anymore, but you lived here for a long time, and you escaped. Like some of us are still stuck here, but you've been around long enough to really know a lot of the insiders that's going on in both political parties and understanding the media landscape of the United States. And what we want to talk about today is do a bit of a deep dive in something that people are starting to see a little bit in snippets here. And what we're going to show you viewers here in just a second is two ads, or actually one ad and then another. Well, no, I'm sorry. They're actually both ads, one by Republican, one by Democrats. And the thing that's interesting about both, that's unique or that's the same, is that they're both about the Ukraine war. But there's a couple of real differences. And we want to talk about what those differences are and what the implications may be. So first of all, for everybody's viewing pleasure, let me show you first the one from President Biden, and then following that, one that's called Republicans for Ukraine. Gary, roll.
It was the first time in modern history.
Very significant moment on the world stage.
That an American president went into a war zone not controlled by the United States.
A nearly 40-hour journey in and out of Ukraine.
President Biden left Washington, D.C. at 4 a.m. on Sunday. He landed in eastern Poland and then took a 9.5-hour train to Kyiv.
He entered Ukraine under the cover of night. And in the morning, Joe Biden walked shoulder to shoulder with our allies in the war-torn streets, standing up for democracy in a place where a tyrant is waging war to take it away.
Air raid sirens blared as the two men walked together.
In the middle of a war zone, Joe Biden showed the world what America is made of. That's the quiet strength of a true leader who doesn't back down to a dictator. Biden, president.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
When America arms Ukraine, we get a lot for a little. Putin is an enemy of America. We've used 5% of our defense budget to arm Ukraine, and with it, they've destroyed 50% of Putin's army. We've done all this by sending weapons from storage, not our troops. The more Ukraine weakens Russia, the more it also weakens Russia's closest ally, China. America needs to stand strong against our enemies. That's why Republicans in Congress must continue to support Ukraine.
Harry, we've actually done deep dive episodes individually on both of those to look at some of the details that you'll find in each of them. But on this particular episode, I wanted to get your take on the dynamics within the U.S. government, especially because, so many of the people want to characterize this as that, you've seen them all that had the little Ukrainian flags on their Facebook profiles. And I see, Ukrainian flags out on the road when I drive around, and everybody says, this is for Ukraine, this is for democracy and all this. But an interesting similarity between both of these ads is that you never heard any mention of the Ukraine people. There was never any talk about, hey, we're helping them regain their freedom or anything at all about the Ukrainian people. It was, hey, let's use the Ukraine war to make my side look good and to do stuff for my side the way that we want to do it. And I just found that to be very interesting and wonder what you think is behind that. Why is there no talk about the Ukrainian people? And what does Washington really care about this? Do we really care about helping Ukraine, or do we just care about hurting Russia?
Danny, that's a lot to unpack. Let me start by this, and then I'll sort of walk my way into your question. I think the real fundamental problem when it comes to the Ukraine war is actually very simple, but it's the problem that we've had, whether we go back to right after 9/11 when we talk about Afghanistan, whether we talk about the second Iraq war, and that is war aims. And what I mean by war aims is that when you get into a conflict or you're a party in a conflict, you need to have a very clear idea of what you want to get out of that conflict and how you want that war to end. I think when it comes to Ukraine, my biggest problem with it, among many problems, is that the United States does not seem to have any sort of strategy in terms of figuring out how they see the war ending and how they plan to get there. That is what I think is the fundamental problem with all of this. When I've pressed leaders in the Biden camps or some of my old colleagues in the Trump administration, and I ask them this question, you get a lot of very basic answers. Well, we're trying to make sure that Ukraine is a viable state. Okay, that makes sense. We're trying to make sure the Ukrainian military can stand up to Russian aggression. Okay, that makes sense. But you never really get any specifics. And when you start asking questions like, is Ukraine's war aimed to get back territory that it lost 20 months ago or what have you, when Putin had launched his invasion back in February of 2022, you say, yeah, people say, yes, that is definitely one of the war aims. Okay. But expand that argument. Is the Biden administration seeking to help Ukraine get back Crimea? Well, that's where things get a little interesting because nobody really wants to answer that question. So I think it's very hard to have the United States involved as a proxy to a war against Russia when we don't have a clear overall sense of strategy of what we're trying to get out of it, not only for the Ukrainian people, but also in terms of the national interests of the United States. It just isn't clear to me what we're trying to accomplish. I mean, yes, we're trying to make sure that Ukraine doesn't collapse, but what are we trying to do beyond that? Nobody can answer that question. I think the closest we've gotten to it, Danny, is when Zelensky was here for his UN meetings, and I think he was in a 60 Minutes interview, and Scott Pelley asked him, do you want to get Crimea back? Is that your goal? And Zelensky sort of dodged the question. He sort of said yes, but he didn't really go all the way in. So it's very hard to wage a war if you don't really know what you're trying to accomplish. How do you know you're sending enough military supplies? How do you ensure that your troops have the proper training? I think that's really the most basic fundamental problem in all of this. Now, when it comes to that specific commercial, I find it a little disingenuous that Joe Biden is trying to portray himself as a wartime leader. What are we fighting for? What are we sending our arms for? What is the goal? There isn't really a goal. I mean, if this is, if Joe Biden feels that he just morally has to help Ukraine and he's trying to also at the same time score political points to look like a wartime leader, that's going to really fail the sniff test considering all the different, cognitive mistakes he makes on a daily basis, So, I think the challenge here in Ukraine is it's very simple. And I think the American people understand it. I think, when they start asking very basic questions, irregardless of where you sit in the political spectrum, Joe Biden trying to leverage this as, to get some extra points, to take on Donald Trump or whoever it is, it just doesn't really work because I don't think America really understands what we're doing there. And I think we're going to, in the next few months, we're going to have to really make some tough decisions on what those goals are and what we're willing to contribute to make those goals possibly happen. And I think that's where the debate really begins.
Yeah, and I think that's good. And then we'll get into the next video in a minute because I think it tails directly into this. Because directly to your point there, we have to say, are we ready to go like years into the future? And of course, before we do that, you have to answer your first question, which is what's your objective? And that's a very specific question. That means, is your goal once Ukraine has recovered all of their territory back to the February 2022 line? Or is it back to the 2014 line? Or is it all the way into Ukraine? Or is it something less than that? Is it like, well, as soon as we get the line solidified so that there's, both sides can see they can't win and we want to have negotiation? Each one of those has a very, very different level of support. So if you're, the maximalist, then that means we have to be ready to provide thousands of more armored vehicles and delivery vehicles wheeled and tracked and millions more ammunition rounds, millions more artillery shells, and be ready to sustain that for multiple years. If it's the lower end of that spectrum of just let's solidify it, then that means, more defensive weapons and less of them so that you can just hold the line. And until you even answer that, then it's hard to know what to do next. Meanwhile, you have that second video there, which seems to be, wanting to exploit the situation. At least that's the way it seems to me. And I want your view on that some people like to say, hey, look, this is a good opportunity for us to make a bunch of more bombs and missiles and tanks and everything else that we have, not even necessarily for Ukraine, but for our own inventory that they want to build up. But until they also don't seem to have an answer to that question. And what do you think from the other side of this viewpoint?
I think we need to just take this to the logical conclusion, Danny. I mean, let's face it. what does, war hawk Republican and Democrats want out of the Ukraine war? I think there's only one natural conclusion. That's regime change in Moscow and Vladimir Putin replaced with some sort of flowery democracy. I wish that could happen. I mean, look, it would be wonderful. It'd be great if Russia joined NATO and the entire, former Soviet Eastern Bloc joined NATO, and we all sang Kumbaya. But that's just not the reality we live in. And I feel like a lot of people in official Washington take that stance and think, well, somehow if Ukraine, quote unquote, wins the war against Russia, although we never define it, the Putin government would collapse. Now, maybe it will. I don't see that happening. I wish that was the case, but it doesn't seem likely. I think what's more than likely than not is that this is a war that will go on probably for another 2 to 3 years. The United States is going to continue funding it. We're going to kind of follow Ukraine's lead because that's the popular thing to do, whatever their ever-changing war aims are, and just continually funding whatever that strategy is, which could end up being the worst forever war you could ever imagine. But I also think we're starting to get to a point now where we're approaching Russian red lines, where the Russians start to think, I'm not in a situation where I can get a result that I can politically live with. Maybe we start to think about using tactical nuclear weapons. And that's where it gets extremely dangerous, because it isn't clear to me what the Biden administration would do if the Russians tried to use them in maybe some smaller battlefield scenarios to change the line in some directions, to try and intimidate the Ukrainians. I don't really know where that goes. And that's where this gets very, very dangerous. The United States is going to be an increasing pressure in the months and years to come to give the Ukrainians better and better weapons. I mean, you remember this, Danny. I mean, when the war started, people were saying, we'll never give them M1 Abrams tanks. Okay, we gave them 30. It's not a game changer, but they're going to give them more. I mean, that's where this is coming. Precision guided munitions. We'll never give the Ukrainians precision guided munitions. Well, it seems like they're on the way. I think at this point, nothing short of the F-35 is really what's on the table at this point, to be honest with you.
Yeah, we've given pretty much everything else they've asked, just 5 or 6 months afterwards. But these ATACMS are the last thing that they've asked for that they haven't gotten. So I don't know what's coming next. But
yeah, and I think
let me ask you a question though, because staying on this issue of how the Republicans and Democrats are both viewing this war, as we speak right now, there's still a dramatic competition going on just north of where I'm at right now in Washington on the budget impasse and whether or not there's going to be a government shutdown. And one of the key parts of this whole debate is the support to Ukraine. Now, within the Republican side, you actually have a lot of confusion about whether they should or shouldn't support the war in Ukraine. And on the Democratic side, they do seem to be lined up behind paying for it more. But you have a lot of even some of the Republicans in the main line that are willing to pass a budget for right now. They do seem to be more and more reluctant to just like open the floodgates. As we had an episode here not long ago, you had Senator Josh Hawley come out of a meeting with Zelensky when he was here last week. And he said that he was told by the administration that they're looking for $100 billion more in the coming months, not just 24 that's on the table right now. And he asked the same question you did. Well, what's the strategy? What's the objective? What are you trying to get? And of course, there's no answers. They say basically stalemate, which is not satisfactory. So there's probably likely that you're going to get some kind of a deal done here, even if it's a temporary shutdown, that's going to probably fund something now. But the question is there appetite politically in the United States, especially getting into a campaign year, for just keeping that open end if there's no result for Ukraine?
I mean, Danny, I hear another $100 billion. That's on top of the other $115 billion that is already earmarked for Ukraine. That's on top of the $30 billion that the European Union and other countries are giving. Right. I mean, we're coming close to $250 billion in terms of total aid, whether we're talking about military aid, economic aid, and so forth. I mean, what's next? Are we going to start sending Ukraine aircraft carriers? I mean, that's the type of dollars we're talking about here. And I mean, and if you have absolutely no strategy, it gets extraordinarily dangerous when you're sitting in Moscow and you're thinking, my God, the Americans are literally coming to my gates and trying to throw me out of office. And keep in mind this point, and this is something very important, Dave, that I think we have to go back to. Joe Biden, when he went to Eastern Europe during the beginning of the war, what did he say about Vladimir Putin? My God, this man's got to go. That phrase has never left the Russian psyche, because that's what they secretly think. They're afraid that they're going to be regime changed and that Putin is going to be dragged to The Hague for war crimes. I mean, look, the man is a war criminal. There's no doubt about that. But the challenge here is that we have to figure out a way for this war to slowly wind down, because I think where it ends up, Danny, is no side wins. It's going to end up being kind of like the Korean War in a lot of ways. I see a lot of parallels between that. I know about a year ago that was sort of the fashionable thing to say, but I think it's becoming more and more clear that this is a war that's going to end up in stalemate, unless the United States does want to give another $100 billion and essentially fight the war on Ukraine's behalf, maybe not with U.S. troops, but literally giving them every piece of military hardware and kit we have to fight that war. And I think that's when the Russians start using tactical nuclear weapons, and that's when we get to World War III.
Yeah. Because, I think that an argument can be made that there's a plausible case that Russia could actually conquer more territory in the coming 6 to 9 months, because Ukraine's offensive capacity is just about spent right now. There's not much left they have aside from the winter weather coming. They just don't have the manpower to push much beyond where they're at already. And it's possible that Russia could push a bit further. But my very strong contention is that even if Putin said, I want all of Ukraine, which I think it's very clear he doesn't, I don't think he has the military capacity in the foreseeable future. I'm talking measured in years to even make good on that if he wanted to. I think that he might want to get a little bit more so that he can have a negotiation to end. And then the question is going to be if the other side's not willing to end in a negotiation, whether they take more or whether the lines stay where they're at there, then all of the things you just mentioned come into play, especially for the U.S. Are we willing to just perpetually get into another never-ending Korean War style, just tens of or hundreds of billions every year or two? And I don't know the answer is going to be yes. And if it's not, then again, we have to get back to what you started with. What's the strategy? Because if it doesn't work here, if it doesn't escalate into nuclear weapons, God help us if that ever happens. What's our answer if it turns into a stalemate? At what point do we say, we're just not going to keep giving you all our tanks and planes and howitzers, and we don't have enough ammunition anymore to give you at the rates that you're using them? And then now what do? You stop supplying them while they still say they want to fight? And no one's thinking about those are really, really hard questions that are going to have to be answered, and pretty soon.
Yeah, nobody is thinking about it, Danny. I mean, I think we've got at least another year to 18 months of fighting. I think the United States is going to spend, probably, I hope not another 100 billion, but I do think a lot more money will be spent. A lot more military hardware and kit will be sent. I think a lot more Ukrainians will be coming to the United States and the UK and Europe for training. But I would ask people to think about this point for a minute, just to broaden our conversation out for a second. Recently I've done a lot of work going up and down the East Coast, whether for personal reasons, but for other work-related reasons. I can't talk too much about it, but I've had a chance to really spend a lot of time in our country in places I never really got to go. Off the highways and byways of places like South Carolina, of Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, parts of the South. And I can tell you, I remember going to some of these places when I was a kid back in the 1990s, and they were boomtown. People had jobs, people looked happy. There was an excitement in the country that things were moving in the right direction after the Cold War. A lot of investment was being made. That peace dividend was a real thing. And people, there was an exuberance in the country. I went back to some of these places recently, maybe not the exact same places, but pretty close. And I saw a lot of closed malls, closed shops, busted businesses, abandoned buildings, people that looked like they had no hope, no future. And it was really sad, to be honest with you. And I keep coming back to this idea, Danny, that, eventually the American people, I think they're willing to support a free and viable Ukraine. I don't think that's I think that's a good thing. But I think just like anything, our country really needs to start thinking about, what about our infrastructure? What about our schools? What about our failing businesses? I mean, Danny, as you know, the United States is almost $32 trillion in debt. This year alone, we're going to run a budget deficit of $2 trillion. That is insane when we're not fighting a war or we're not fighting COVID-19. I mean, eventually the United States is going to be bankrupt. So we need to think very carefully about the strategic choices we make, because they have real consequences at home, because we can't invest in home. And that's a problem.
That is such a great point, Harry. I mean, I've seen some of that just around here. even in the areas where I live south of and west of Washington, D.C., I can only imagine when you get further out into the hinterland. And I think that that's something that, especially as you get into a campaign season, gets closer up, that more people are going to be making that comment that, yeah, I mean, Ukraine, I don't want them to be invaded like any country, but man, look at my town here. And what are you going to do for our people? That's got to come in there first before we start doing stuff overseas. And it can't come at the expense of helping our people.
And just
So
a quick,
yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick follow-on, Danny, because it just dives into this, and I think it's important. Where is Europe? I mean, I know that's a very fashionable question in the realist circles we travel. You know, how come the Europeans aren't investing more? But I mean, you can look at the totals. It's somewhere between only $30 and $40 billion in aid that Europeans collectively have given to Ukraine. Where's all their surplus tanks? I mean, they've given some, but not enough. I mean, where's the advanced training in terms of combined arms training that they can help the Europeans with? There's been some, but not enough. I mean, the United States has been very generous with our arms, our blood, our treasures, our sons and daughters going to Europe to fight. I'm not against any of that. I am here in the United States as a Greek American because the United States helped free my ancestors from the yoke of Nazi tyranny. So I'm very aware of that. I would not be a hypocrite. But at the same time, the United States needs to impress upon Europe the fact that this is in your backyard. It is in your interest to solve this problem. And I just don't see that level of urgency. And I think it's really important the Biden administration do it. Or if a Republican administration goes into office, and especially if it's Donald Trump, he's going to look at them and say, you need to get your you-know-what together, or I'm not going to fund this war. So I think the Europeans need to start thinking about some of these things.
Yeah, I think that every American, or most Americans I know, would be enthusiastic in support of what you just said there, because we want to help others. We're desirous to help others. But man, there's got to come a point to where, you know, the other side of this equation, the other side of our friendly equation, has to actually step up more, because they're the ones that are most effective. It's in Europe, for crying out loud. And you know, if there's going to be some pain, it's got to be equally spread out. Right now, it's just not equitable. And Harry, look, I'm a big supporter of American leadership. No one's suggesting that we, you know, lead from behind, like is the common, you know, pejorative that people want to throw anytime somebody suggests that we do less. But it's not a matter of doing less. It's a matter of prioritizing our people, and the folks that have money and the proximity do what's appropriate there too. That, in my view, is leadership, to say, hey, we need you guys to step up and do your part, because we're doing more than our part right now, and we need a little bit more equality in that.
Amen.
But listen, Harry, I really appreciate this. This is why you're such a friend of the show. Can't wait to whatever our next episode is going to be when we have you back. And folks at home, this is why we have Deep Dive, because you're getting information here you're just not going to get anywhere else. And we're going to continue doing this to bring you all the things you need on the issues that are most important to you. And I can't wait to see you on the next episode. Talk to you later. This is Daniel Davis on the Deep Dive.